Chapter 16 Geysers. There were 26 of the geysers all told. Their long straw petticoats and high pointed hats made them all seem taller than ordinary men. The bunches of colored ribbons tied on their petticoats, hats, and shirts were like curiously shaped fruit and flowers sprouting everywhere from them. The eyes above their handkerchief masks looked out like the eyes of mysterious strangers. Like strangers, too, they entered in deadly silence, for, as Robbie had just proved, even a few words spoken could give away the secret behind the mask. A shout of greeting went up at the sight of them, and everyone rose so that there would be room for them to dance. Chairs were pushed back against the walls. Peter raised his fiddle, and still without a word spoken, the Scuddler's men formed a circle with the Scuddler himself at its center. Peter struck an opening chord. The Scuddler raised his long white wand in his right hand. Peter swung into a fast-stepping reel, and with a swish of his wand, the Scuddler commanded the dance to begin. Instantly then, the butt end seemed to explode into a whirling mass of straw. Tall hats shot up and down like tongues of flame, flickering through the mass. Colored ribbons tossed about in it, like fruit falling, like flowers being torn off in a gale. The watchers in the butt end clapped in time to the dancers' antics. They cheered, they laughed, they shouted out guesses about which face lay behind which mask. For all the wildness of this dance, however, it was still carried on in deadly silence. It was still under the Scuddler's command too, for it was his wand that commanded to direct all of its movements. Up and down the dancers leapt. In and out they wove. Round and about they whirled and twisted, all in obedience to the wand. The signals from this divided them into pairs, into larger groups, and then brought them back into one mass. Another signal stilled all the others while each man danced alone, and as he danced, each and every man kept his eyes on the wand. Each and every man danced for the Scuddler, but the Scuddler himself never shifted position. It was only the hand with the wand in it that moved, and his eyes. The eyes of the Scuddler were everywhere, darting from dancer to dancer, and away at the back of his mind. As he watched this, Robbie heard once more the voice of old Da explaining to him the dance of the Scuddler's men. They're supposed to be earth spirits, the spirits of corn and fruit and flowers, and the Scuddler himself is the god of the earth, commanding them to dance in honor of all the good things he has created. And what's the meaning of it all? A voice breathed in Robbie's ear. Turning towards the sound, he met the gaze of big dark eyes, Finn Learson's eyes drawing him into the same circle of mysterious power that held Tam and Elspeth. Finn Learson guessing at the knowledge old Da had passed and probing his mind for the secret of it. I don't know, Robbie lied, trying hard to break away from the gaze, but the voice of old Da was still running through his mind, and he was desperately afraid that Finn Learson could somehow also hear it. It was the way they made magic in the old heathen days, Robbie. The dressing up was sort of a spell, the dancing was another part of the spell, and the whole thing made a magic that turned into the creatures they were supposed to be, the earth god and his spirits. Who's playing the Scuddler? Finn Learson demanded. Do you know that? Robbie backed off from the eyes boring into his own, then found that he had backed into his mother, and sighed with relief to hear her answering for him. Nobody knows, she told Finn Learson. The young men always decide that among themselves, and it won't be until they all unmask at the end of Uphelia. That's when we learn which of them it is. A burst of cheering and clapping from all around announced the sudden end of the dance. Robbie found himself once more surrounded by the geysers as they crowded to take their share of the food and drink laid out. Shouts of laughter came from people jostling to watch each one swallow as much as he could without lifting more than a corner of his mask. Then Peter's fiddle shrilled out again. The Scuddler's men swept back onto the dancing space, each with a partner from among the guests. Another fiddler joined Peter's efforts, and yet another. The butt end became a wild, weaving whirl of figures stamping in time to the music. The laughing faces of girls bobbed about among the white masks, of the geysers. Peter and the other two fiddlers stood perched above the dancers, their faces red and shining with sweat, their bows racing back and forth at mad speed across the fiddle strings. Somebody seized Robbie's hand and pulled him into the whirl of the dancers. He caught the gleam of white teeth and dark eyes as Finlayson spun by, laughing, with Janet in his arms. A tall figure loomed over him. A masked face looked down, and the grim eyes of the scuddler met his own. Briefly he glimpsed Elspeth's hair in the tangle of gold and scarlet ribbon, and then he was too dizzy to be aware of anything else except the floor heaving under his feet and the roof rafters seeming to turn like the spokes of a huge wheel above his head. A gust of cold night air and a last ringing chord from the fiddles brought him to himself. Somebody had opened the door, he realized. The dance was at an end, and the geysers were departing to visit the next house on their rounds. Silent to the last, they were beginning to vanish through the doorway, waving farewells as they went, and all the younger folk among the guests were jostling to follow them. Robbie was still dizzy. He held onto a chair, steadying himself, and to his dismay, saw that Finlayson and Elspeth were among those following in the wake of the scuddler and his men. Quickly, in case his father or mother saw him leave, he ducked low and slid neatly in among the jostling throng. The next moment he was outside and catching his breath in wonder at what he had saw there, for there was a strange tingling feeling in the air, and instead of the velvety darkness he had expected, the whole sky was aflame with green leaping light. Somebody shouted, "It's the Merry Dancers!" which is the name they have in these parts for those peculiar lights that sometimes leap and flicker over the northern skies in winter. And this cry was taken up on all sides, for nobody could think when they had last seen so fine a display of these northern lights. Every face stared upwards, and everyone began turning round and round as they stared, for the lights seemed sometimes to roll in great green waves over the sky, and sometimes it was like long searchlights of green, shooting brilliantly out from a huge and starless black dome. Sometimes, too, all the green would vanish for a few seconds, and everybody was blinded by darkness until the lights appeared again, and little tongues of leaping, dancing green flame. Robbie stared upwards with the rest, all thoughts of Elspeth suddenly forgotten in his wonder at the sky. Then, too late, he realized that the scuddler and his men had moved on, and the others were following in little groups that straggled all over the hillside. Shouting, he ran to catch up with the nearest of these groups, then stopped in sudden terror that they might be Trows, for part of the power Trows have on Uphelia is that they can take on any shape they wish. Yet still, he reminded himself, he had to keep track of Finlayson and Elspeth. He simply had to. In a shaking voice he mumbled, "God be about me in all that I see." Then hastily he crossed himself and stumbled on, but it still did not prove easy to find Finlayson and Elspeth among all those straggling groups, and with every hour after that, Robbie found it growing even harder to keep on their trail. At the next house, the scuddler and his band departed without any train of followers, but still there were people visiting back and forth between all the houses scattered over the hill. For in every house that night there was light, and music, and celebration of some kind. Moreover, Elspeth was as footloose as any of the others roaming the hill, and in each house she and Finlayson visited, Robbie seemed to find himself being caught up in the celebrations at the very moment these two were ready to leave for some other place. In one house, it was a guessing game that had him trapped among the boys of his own age, all clustering around him to sort a riddle. Wingle wangle like a tangle. If I was even, I'd reach to heaven. The more he tried to free himself too, the louder they called, "What am I? Guess, Robbie Henderson, guess!" But still Robbie could not guess, till Elspeth herself gave him the clue. Turning at the doorway with Finlayson, she smiled goodbye at everyone else, and there in a flash Robbie remembered her footprint in the lick straw, and the tangle of smoke uncoiling slowly out towards the summer sky. "Smoke!" Triumphantly he shouted the answer, and darted outside to follow the two figures dancing and running on their way under the green lights of the merry dancers. In another house, it was a dance that held him marooned in a corner while Elspeth disappeared. In yet another house, he was helping to hand around the food when she decided to move on, and he had no choice but to drop a plate of scones to the floor while he dashed after her. Yet still, in spite of all such problems, he had to make sure Finlayson did not notice how closely he was keeping on Elspeth's trail. And a dozen times that night he blessed Nickel for the scarlet hair ribbons that picked her out from all the other people milling around. The further the night went on, however, the more difficult he found it to keep her always under his eye. For the further the night went on, of course, the more tired he grew. His legs began to ache with running over the tough, springy grass of the hill. His eyes smarted from the lack of sleep, and it was the smarting eyes which at last betrayed him. One moment, he had the will-o'-wisp figure of Elspeth full in view as she danced ahead of him across the hill. The next moment, his weary eyelids drooped, and before he could blink them open again, the green of the northern lights had vanished behind one of the sky's spells of total darkness.